Hello, friends. Welcome to the work item. And we're getting to the end of the year. What a year it has been. And speaking of which, I should probably introduce you to our guest, Christina Warren. Welcome, Christina.
Hey, Jen. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here because I have so many questions about your career. And I know it's been a while since we chatted in person. How long has it been?
Years, unfortunately.
Years? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in person, we've chatted over like video calls and stuff, but in person, I think it's been probably 2 years.
Wow. Yeah, I think I remember you and the team came to Vancouver for, was it like a hackathon?
It was a
Maybe
hackathon or something. Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. Wow, time flies. And I don't know, I lost track of time. But anyway, the show is about your career. We're here to learn about your career specifically, Christina. So why don't we start with probably the most salient question of the podcast? What are you up to these days?
Okay, so I am a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft, and I focus on Linux. And so, which is sort of funny in some ways. As we talk more, I think go backwards in my career. There are some funny things there, but I focus on Linux and primarily kind of the developer experience for Linux on Azure. And I work in the developer relations group, which means that I connect with users of Azure and Linux users who are either on Azure and are frustrated or like it or might not even know what options we have. And then I also work with the different product teams who work on the various parts of Azure and who work in the various parts of Linux within Microsoft. And I work with the marketing folks too. So to kind of all kind of three of those groups kind of trying to help tell the story and get people the best experience they can get using our tools, especially if they're developing on Linux.
Linux at Microsoft. For
Yeah,
folks that are listening to this and they're probably
I know.
like,
Like hell
wait,
froze
what?
over. They're like, wait, what? Yeah, no, and it's hilarious because obviously at this point, Microsoft is a massive contributor to open source, and we have done a complete. I say we. I'm not speaking for the company, but the company has done a complete 180 from its position 20 years ago when it comes to both open source and Linux. But I'm with you. It still is not one of those, like the fact that I was issued a work issued MacBook, and that, we have, Linux services and products and whole teams. There's like a part of me, I'm like, okay, what universe did I enter into? Because a decade ago, that would not have been the case, right? I've been with Microsoft for about 4.5 years, and when I joined, things had already kind of been changing for, a couple of years, I think kind of internally and externally, in terms of how people kind of saw Microsoft as not being so attached to like the Windows behemoth, especially, for developer stuff. But in that last 4.5 years, it's changed even more. And it's been interesting to see, but it's still, there is like this, okay, so I, like advocate for Linux at Microsoft. It's like, yup, that is the world we live in.
I don't know how to even describe it because this is the contrast to me. The image that pops into my head, was it Ballmer at the time that threw an iPhone? I think that was the case. Or something along those lines.
Well, he threw an iPhone at somebody. I don't remember what it was. Like, and they used to have a thing, I think, like in the Microsoft campuses, at least I remember reading this stuff, who knows if it was true or not, where they had like recycle bins or something where people were supposed to throw their iPods so that they could get Zunes instead, because that worked. Although funnily enough, I did buy a Zune a couple of years ago off of eBay. I'd never owned a Zune because, Mac user. But I bought a Zune, and then it was supposed to be refurbished and supposed to have a new battery, but I don't think it really did. And it was cool to like look at all this tech they had like in 2010 that was, or 2009 even, I think that was like actually really ahead of its time. Like they had like an OLED screen, and like as terms of like a media player, it was actually really, really good. And I bought one a couple years ago and then tried to get it working, still with like modern Windows and stuff. And I wound up doing something wrong and kind of borking my system. It was fine. I brought it back, but it was one of those things where I was like, "Yep, this was fun," but it was reminded me of kind of, oh right, Microsoft did try to get into MP3 players, kind of thing. But it was very much like it used to be this world of we have our tools and services and our world, and that is the way that it is. And if you try to use anything else, then you can't do it. And which it's kind of like what Apple's whole raison d'etre is. But now I think that hadn't historically been how Microsoft was. Like Microsoft, when it started, like was you know writing interpreters and basic stuff for Apple stuff, as well as for DOS, and then created Windows. And now I think it's kind of started to go back to that place where it's like, okay, we have really cool tools and services for people wherever you might be, which I personally appreciate that approach a lot more. And I think as working with developers appreciate that approach more. But memories are long, and it's still, for those, especially for those of us who have been around a while in tech, you remember, like, you remember the memes, and it doesn't go away.
It's funny because I was literally just a couple of days ago talking to my wife about this stuff where the iPhone, we take it for granted these days. Like, yeah, it's an iPhone, whatever. It's like 14 years. It's 14. That's a massive amount of time for technology.
Massive. And it feels like yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
Honestly, it does. And it's so funny because I oftentimes, my career in kind of the traditional sense, I guess, kind of really did start around the same time the iPhone came out. And so I don't like to even think about that, because I'm like, okay, I'm getting older and this and that. But like, it's so interesting for me to even think about like what the world was like then. And everybody was super excited about the phone. I was super excited about the phone, but I wasn't convinced that it was going to be successful. I wasn't convinced that because of all the things that Apple had going against it, you could only get it on AT&T, and it didn't have these other features, and it cost all this money. And I was just like, okay, it didn't have apps. Like, there were all these hurdles to overcome. And then you used it. And even though the very first version wasn't that great, by the time the second version came out a year later, and then they had the iPod Touch, it was just like, okay, this is the future. Like, everything else suddenly looked old. Like, from the minute it came out, even, like, you went from thinking, oh, my Blackberry is the coolest thing ever, to like literally June 29th, 2007 was the last time anybody thought their Blackberry looked cool, because then you had this thing from the future just staring you in the face.
I remember reading an article, and I'm pretty sure it's still on archive.org, so we can pull it up at some point, but somebody wrote this long laundry list of why the iPhone is going to fail. It's like, it doesn't have a keyboard, it doesn't have copy paste, it doesn't have the enterprise buy-in, because
Yep.
everyone was on Blackberry, and that was the big thing back then.
Yep.
And wow, what a wrong prediction.
No, and and the thing is, though, those things would have killed, I think, almost anything else, right? Like, I think that any one of those things for a lot of people would have been kind of a no-brainer, because it didn't have the enterprise support. It did get copy paste. I think those came at the same time. It never got a keyboard because sorry, Jim Lazaridis, who loved his Blackberry keyboard, and for the very few people who are still out there who like love their physical keyboards, like that model just was replaced with something better once you had capacitive touchscreens. But the interesting thing is that it didn't matter. You had the web in your pocket. Like, that to me was the whole thing. It was like putting everything else aside. I don't even think it had MMS at first. Like, putting everything else aside, it was like you had the web in your pocket, and that just, it's hard to overstate how important I think that was. And how, when you look back, God, we're almost at the 15-year mark of Steve Jobs giving that Macworld keynote and unveiling the iPhone to everyone, being like, yes, it is, an iPod. It is, personal communicator. It is, I can't remember what the third thing, it is a phone. Like, it is all these things in one. And it's changed. It's changed everything.
I feel like it's one of those things where, the same as you just described, that revelation of, hold on a second, I can actually open a real web page, not the kneecap version of a web
not
page.
The kneecap version, not the terrible like .mobi pages that we used to have to build. Oh my God, the WAP pages. Remember WAP?
Yep, the one with like 4 bullet point lists, and you just have to like
and then there was like this weird form of HTML that you would have to do if you wanted it to like like work that wasn't actually a standardized thing. I used to do some freelance stuff for that when I was in college, and it used to like be the bane of my existence. And I did not charge enough money to do that sort of stuff. It was god awful. But right, you had the real web. Like you had like, okay, I can zoom in. I can do, like I can zoom if I need to. I can do pinch to zoom and make it bigger. But like the actual web that I visit on my computer is going to be the same thing that I see on the screen in my pocket.
And on that technological throwback,
Yes.
You clearly care a lot about the space. You know a lot about the space. And even before coming to Microsoft, you had a lot of this interest. What sparked all of it? Where did it all come from?
God, I mean, I've loved gadgets, I guess, for as long as I can remember. I have fond memories of like learning to program my VCR, when I was like, 3 or 4 years old. And I was always into, like cassette tapes and things like that. And I was really, really into video games, which I think is common for a lot of people who get into tech. Like video games are for many of us like our entry point. And I loved it. But for me, it was interesting because I didn't really get into computers until I was about 12. We had computers at school and we had a computer at home, but it was a laptop and it was like 20 pounds. It was a 386 and it was, like my dad's, and it had a black and white screen, and, it wasn't anything like super fun, to play with. And so I didn't have like that typical experience where like, oh, I have, like, I'm going to create stuff in BASIC or whatever. Like I didn't have that stuff. I think I programmed some things in Logo on the Mac in, like 4th or 5th grade. But the big thing for me, but I'd always been interested in technology. The big thing for me was the web. The web, I always say, was like my first true love. And I remember when I first read about the internet and the World Wide Web I think it was in a video game magazine, actually. It might have been something else. And I think it was something about like a modem that came out for the Super Nintendo. And they talked about these online services. And it was kind of like there was this service that was kind of a cross between kind of like AOL but it had some like full access to the full internet. And this was back when like you had to make that distinction because you had like the real web, and then you had like, like the online services that had their own kind of walled garden things. And I was young, I was like 11 or 12. And I remember reading about that and just being so excited by that concept of like, oh, there's all this information out there that's accessible and that's creative. Like I remember I think my first time I was ever on the internet proper, I was on Usenet, and I don't know, I think I was in the 3rd grade, and it was a Melrose Place Usenet thing, which dates me on a lot of levels. And I was probably too young to be on alt.tv.melrose place or whatever, but who cares? But that was kind of a revelation in and of itself, even though it was all text, because I was like, oh, there are all these people talking about this TV show that I'm obsessed with. And then when I learned more about the web and the fact that you could create these pages and you could have all this information, anybody could just visit it, and you had this opportunity to build things, like I fell in love. And I say that was my first true love because it was. And so it was something that I think for me, more than anything else, like I got, I learned about other aspects of computing, and I got into other, types of things, and learned, about the specs and the apps and how to do things and networking, this and that. But the real thing that always for me was like the thing that made me go, I have to learn more about this, was the web. The web is my like one true love, like my first love, honestly.
Yeah, you were talking about the video game stuff, and to me, it just reminded me that was a gateway to computers for myself as well, because I remember playing Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. That was my jam.
Oh, that's the greatest game.
Absolutely should not have been playing at that age. Speaking of which, they remade it and it's just horrible.
Oh, I haven't played the remake yet. Did they mess it up?
Goodness, you have to look at the subreddit for that game right now, because it's just meme factory. I think
oh no,
they botched it really, really bad. Like the graphics.
That's so upsetting.
Yes. As somebody that grew up on that thing, I was just
I grew up on that too. I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up on that too, and I loved those games. Like those games were hardcore. Like Vice City was.
Yeah. God, oh my God, Tommy Vercetti.
Yeah, Tommy Vercetti, you know, the music, the whole thing. Like I used to just spend so much time like driving around and whatnot. I got to the point that I would see cars out and I'd be like, I could just jump inside that car. I'm like, no, you can't. Um, you can't steal a car, Christina. You can't do that. But no, but you know, but those games were like amazing. And that's disappointing. I've been so busy with some other stuff that I've totally missed the whole discourse of the remakes. But they did such a good job. Well, it was a different studio, but like the Tony Hawk people did such a great job. That was one of my games. I don't know if you ever played Tony Hawk Pro
Yes,
Skater.
yeah.
Okay, well the Tony Hawk Pro Skater remake was awesome. Like they did an amazing job with it and kept like the feel and the graphics and the whole move. Like it's one of the best remakes I've ever seen. So that's really upsetting to know that they messed up the GTA 3, which is like that trilogy, that series is, you know, some of the most like iconic games ever.
And I think the problem is that they stripped some of the music, so you no longer have like Billie Jean and Vice City. So it's like that was kind of the theme of that game.
Yeah, it was, and I knew that they did that like
It's
I
licensing. I get
with
it.
licensing. Yeah, well, I get it and I don't get it. It's weird because if you find like some of the old copies on like PlayStation 2 or whatever, like, you know, obviously it still has the music in it. So there are people who've done over the years, they've done like fan rips of like, okay, we've patched the game to like work, but we have like the, you know, the music files or whatever that come from the previous versions. But that's so
I
disappointing.
think part of the problem was the fact that the studio that did the remake built the mobile games. So I think they
Oh,
just grabbed some of that, like the
yeah.
assets from those games, and it just is.
Which, you know, the mobile games weren't bad. Like the ones they did on iOS and stuff, they weren't bad, especially for that time.
Well, of course.
But, but if you're bringing this next gen, um, you can't get away with that like that. You no, you gotta start over. Like it's shame.
The hilarious part to me is then you see the mods that people made in just a couple of days after release, and it's just so much better. And you're like, okay, seriously? Like, how
Yeah,
is somebody that does this as a hobby
right.
do a better job at putting this together than the company with full-time developers?
No, I mean no joke. Especially it's like okay, I realize like obviously they're working on GTA 6 or whatever it is and they won't give us anything. It'll be years. We've now, many of us have bought Grand Theft Auto 5 three or four different times because I bought it for the Xbox 360. I bought it for the Xbox One. I'm going to buy it again for the Xbox Series X when like that like rethink buys it. I think I bought it for the PlayStation 4. I definitely bought it for the place. You know, I'm going to wind up getting the PS5 version. Like I've bought so many freaking copies of this game and it's still going. Like to its credit, it is one of those like good ass games. But yeah, like you can resell us the same game for like 7 years. Fans are the ones who had to fix some of the loading time issues. I think for
Oh, I
GTA
love
Online,
that.
I love that was one of my favorite stories where like they like and they did accept the patch. They're like, thank you, we have now accepted this patch and are running this. But like when you have fans who are not just patching your game for you, but are creating mods that are better than what you're doing, to me at a certain point, I'm like, okay, maybe you should just hire some of them to work on the team or the studio or whatever that does the remake. Like I don't know, just a thought.
Well, instead, they're just gonna file more legal takedowns. So you know.
Right, because why would we want to encourage anybody making it so that the game is more playable and more fun?
Well, and we have clearly so many topics to discuss, but
Yes, so we're supposed to be talking about work, but see, gaming is work.
gaming is work in, you know, some realms. But speaking of also previous work, you had a very, I want to say like unconventional career getting into advocacy because you were
Yeah.
a senior writer at Gizmodo before.
Yeah, I worked at Gizmodo. I worked at Mashable. I used to go on TV networks like CNN and CNBC, and you know, places like that, and talk about tech and other things. And you're right; it is kind of an unconventional way of getting into it. So originally, when I went to college, I didn't study computer science. I learned to code, and I loved computers, but I just, frankly, some of the experiences that I'd had in some of my classes in high school made me think, I don't know if I want to work with these people. Like there's no other way for me to say it and be nice. But some of the dudes who were in my classes and the way they made me feel and stuff, I was just like, I don't have to do this. I enjoy this, but I actually have other interests and other skills. And if you're going to be a jerk to me and make me feel inferior, even though I'm doing better in my class than you, then I don't have to necessarily study this. And so I was like, well, I'm going to go to film school, which, is a very expensive, stupid thing to do. But my goal always with that, I was like, okay, obviously I can do nothing with a film degree. Like I'm not going to be Martin Scorsese, and I'm not going to be, like Steven Spielberg. Like I have great respect for them, but I know myself, and I'm like, I'm not an auteur in that way, even though I would love to be that way, but I'm not. So my thought was always, okay, I'll go to law school and I'll be an entertainment attorney or maybe a technology attorney, actually, was my thought. I was like, because my interest in tech and the fact that I still did keep up with everything and was still a huge, fan of all that stuff. And then when I graduated from college, it was right when the financial crisis happened. And that changed things because it meant that going to law school, which was going to be expensive, was not something that my parents could then like afford to pay for. They were like, you will have to get student loans. And I was like, well, that will be very expensive. And so it became one of these things where, to be completely candid, I was like, I'm looking at taking out $250,000 in debt to go to law school. And I don't know if I will have a job when I graduate. And so my senior year of college, I had started doing some blogging and some writing. It started out doing some music journalism stuff about American Idol, if you can believe it or not, which is embarrassing to admit, but here we are. And people had noticed me on, ironically, this would never happen now, but it was kind of amazing that it even happened then. I'd been a frequent commenter on the music editor at USA Today's music blog, and he liked my comments. And so they asked me to contribute a column about American Idol to the paper and online. And I'm a senior in college. I don't have any professional writing experience up to this point. I've been writing my whole life. I'm a good writer, but that was my first, paid experience. And then I started blogging because blogging was becoming kind of a big thing then. And so I was writing for websites like the unofficial Apple weblog, which no longer exists, RIP, and a website called Download Squad, which was kind of like Engadget, but for software, and some other sites. And I, wasn't getting paid very much money to do it, but I enjoyed doing those things. And it was cool for me because I was like, well, I get to write about, I was also writing about pop culture for some various sites. I was like, well, this is fun for me because I get to write about all the stuff I care about, I'm interested in. And I would figure out, hacks or how to do things, and share stuff with people. And that was fun. And what wound up happening was that, again, like I'm now faced with this weird decision where I'm like, I don't know if, I'm going to have a job if I go to law school. If I'll have a job when I get out and then I'll be saddled with all this debt. I kind of was like, well, maybe I can give this writing thing a try. And I was young enough and naive enough and had enough, like, this is why it's good to be young in these cases, because now I would look at that situation and be like, oh, that'd be really risky. But I was like, okay, cool, we'll give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen? And I wound up being successful at it, which is not common. I was very, very lucky. I had a lot of really good mentors, but I was able to, get more attention. I was fairly early on Twitter, and that helped me a lot. And, kind of grow, an audience, so to speak. And then I started working for a website called Mashable in 2009. And that they hired me full time. And when I joined, I think I was the 9th employee. And the site was really big. It was a really, really big blog at the time, especially in kind of the web 2.0 and kind of tech space. And I worked there for 7 years. And I think, at its peak, there were over 300 people, at the company. So I got to see a startup actually go from 9 people to 300 people and to see what those changes were, which was really interesting. I got to write about a ton of different topics, and they were incredibly gracious to me and letting me really explore my various interests. At various times, my title was everything from like, I think mobile app reporter, web reporter. I was the original entertainment editor. I created that section. Then I was like senior tech analyst, senior tech correspondent. And I wrote about, things that I was interested in. And a lot of them were things around developer focused areas, because I'd done some freelance web stuff when I was in college and a little bit after when I was still doing freelance writing. But, it wasn't like my primary job, but it was something I still kept up with the industry, and I still kept up with what was happening in the space and what was happening, in programming circles in general, especially when, like I said, I kind of think about my career starting when the iPhone launched, when iOS development started. Like that was a massive, massive thing. Mobile app development was this massive area, and I was really into that. And I saw that was going to be a huge trend, both for mobile web development, but also mobile app development, right? Both native and whatnot. And I was picked up, kind of the rise of JavaScript. Like these were things I could see happening, and that I was interested in and writing about. I left Mashable and I went to Gizmodo, and I did some of the similar things there. And then I got a reach out from a recruiter that wound up leading me to Microsoft, where, I now work, in developer relations and in advocacy. And in some ways, my journey of getting to what I do is very, very different from most of my colleagues. And most people worked, either they were well-known kind of indie devs, or they worked for larger companies, or they, worked at smaller companies, built their own things. But me, I always was in that space, and we're talking with those people and would know enough to be able to build things and break it, but have fun. But I think that I was always telling stories, I think, about what those developers were doing, and what their struggles were, and what their wishes were, and what the opportunities were, and what was exciting, what was coming next. I was always telling developer stories, even though that wasn't, the only thing I focused on. And so even though it was a weird way of getting into DevRel, in some cases it made total sense, because it was like, well, now I'm still telling people stories. It's just in a different way. And I'm still listening to feedback, but now maybe I have a chance to impact it and make, changes and make things better. But also a way to showcase, hey, this is the really cool stuff people are doing that deserves to be seen. And so in some ways, it was a very, very real career switch. And it was to go from, being a writer and editor and kind of, commentator and whatnot, to being, working at a tech company and working with engineering teams. But in other ways, I do feel like I have just my whole career going all the way back, even before, actually, funnily enough, if I go back to when I was in high school, and I was writing, Windows 90, Windows 98, tips of the day and stuff like that, and writing reviews of software and things like that, and little hacks and how people could get things done. I've always been telling developer stories. And so it was a weird way of getting there, but at the same time, I feel like it was something that I was uniquely kind of positioned for, if that makes any sense.
So that part about storytelling, I think there's this bit of a misconception when folks think about developer advocates, because there's this external views like, oh, developer advocates just go to conferences and they write articles. That's all they do.
Right.
But there's more to it. Tell me more about, where do you see that overlap between your past work as a writer, somebody that was telling these stories, and what do you do now as a developer advocate?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like storytelling is a key part of it. And you're right. A lot of people think developer advocates, they are the ones who speak at conferences and maybe write blog posts, maybe show demos, and spend too much time online on Twitter. And all those things are true, especially the part about spending too much time on Twitter. That is absolutely true, and I'm very guilty of that. But I think one of the core things, and I think one of the reasons why, the reason I've always kind of thought about it, and it was funny because before I even went into journalism, there was a time, we used to call what we now call developer advocacy, we used to call it evangelism. And there was a period of time when I was kind of looking at, okay, well, what can I do with my life? And it was funny because there was a part of me that was like, you know what? I could be in DevRel. I could be a developer evangelist. I could do this. And I think that the same thing that struck me there is the same thing that struck me about why I wanted to start blogging or writing, which is that I like to help people, and I like to tell stories, and I like to showcase what things people are doing out there. And I think I'm good at that. And I think that a lot of good developer advocates, I think they're good at, telling a story about how something works and why something is important and why it matters. The story about why I got into the web to begin with, all those possibilities. It was stories in magazines that captured my attention and that made me want to look further, right? But that's what got me into it. And then it was reading, about the experiences and following the projects and the blogs and the other things that the developers were doing that got me excited. But there's so much stuff out there, especially now, it's so hard to follow everything and to keep up. And so I feel like one of the things that developer advocates can do, which is really great, is they can help tell a narrative, whether it's, showing like, look at what this, developer or this company or this, app, like tell the story about how this came to be, or like just giving people a taste of these are some of the things you can build and what you can do, and letting people create their own stories. I think it's about getting people excited about what the possibilities are. Because for me, that's always been my biggest, even with video games, right? Like the thing is, it's like the possibilities of being able to create something and have this other world. I think that's always been the most exciting part. And so I feel like with, advocacy, that's how I feel storytelling is a really key part of that. Is it's about getting people excited, and it's not telling a narrative that somebody wants to push necessarily. I mean, some people do that, but that's really not what it's about. It's about like kind of laying out, this is what's actually happening. Like this is what the real story is. And it's not about, well, this is what we want you to believe. It's like, no, this is the stuff that's happening. Sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's fun, and sometimes it's broken. But this is where it's going, and this is the potential of what maybe other people can then build on and do their own things with.
Yes, and this is where advocacy is not about just promoting product features, it's telling that story, right? Because to
Exactly.
me, if somebody comes up and says, hey, switch to Linux, I'll be I don't know, why would I do that?
Exactly.
Instead of somebody that will come in and be like, here's the cool thing that I built and it runs on Linux and you should try this.
Exactly. I mean, that's how I kind of think about web frameworks, right? It's like, I'm obsessed with like static site generators, and I get too obsessed with all the new ones that come out, and there are a million of them. And it's always when I see somebody like who's showing me like something cool they've built with it, and then I'm in my head, I'm kind of creating. Sometimes they tell me the story themselves. Sometimes they are creating it. Sometimes I'm creating it in myself and in my own head, and I feel like that's the opportunity. It's like, okay, give people enough information, help tell the story so that they can imagine the possibilities themselves, and they can understand like, oh, this is actually really cool. Not, I want you to go use this thing. Like, no, actually just show me how it's being used and what it's trying to solve, and like how you did it,
When you made the switch from being writing full time to being an advocate full time, were there any aha moments that you did not expect going into big corporate tech?
Yes. So there were several. So first, I did not understand, because I went from, newsroom environment, being a journalist, where everything moves incredibly quickly and the hours are not great. And if there is a breaking news global story, it is an all hands on deck situation. Not to say that you don't have that there aren't situations where you're on crunch time because you have a launch that you have to be ready for and that people don't work ridiculous hours. Like crunch is real. I'm not trying to discount that, but it is definitely slower and different in tech than it is in journalism. And that I was not expecting. The hardest thing I think at first, my first probably year at Microsoft to get used to, was how slow everything was, because I would feel like I wasn't doing enough because things just move slower. And it's like, I had to reset myself and go, oh no, you're not in a newsroom where you're expected to be working on these longer form stories, but then you have to keep up with like this constantly moving story and assign, people to do things and to do quick edits, because the news never stops. The news never stops. And so there's never a point where you can say, okay, we've shipped, this thing is completed, right? It's similar to software in that way, and that software, I think some people might say, okay, it's done and I'm not going to add to it anymore. But many times, we want to do updates or new versions. But the news is like, okay, you've got to create a new piece of software every single day. And sometimes you can build from your past work, but sometimes you can't. And so I think getting used to the difference in pace was a really big one. The second thing, and this was actually a really nice experience to learn, I thought going into my job at Microsoft, I thought that my tech background would be the thing that would maybe help me adjust, and that I could rely on the fact that, even though I haven't, worked primarily as a developer, I do know how to code. I am, a developer. I'm somebody who lives and breathes this world. I thought that was going to help me and would help me get adjusted. And it's certainly, my technical acumen has increased so much in 4.5 years. It's crazy how much better I've become at so many different things and how many skills I've picked up. But that really wasn't the thing that helped me. What helped me, and this was interesting, was my soft skills. I didn't realize, I took for granted that not everyone can write well, that not everyone is good at making a persuasive point, that not everyone can be concise when they need to. Then not everyone's a good public speaker. And I found that like my ability to communicate, especially with writing, I think, also with speaking, which is a part of advocacy. Like we were joking, like you speak at conferences, that's what you do. And I, not all journalists have that skill either. I should add, but I did, and I had that skill going into it. But the public speaking stuff aside, like having just the ability to be a good communicator was so beneficial with so many different groups, and not just with the non-technical teams, with technical teams. When I deal with engineering teams, being able to be a good communicator was so much more helpful in many ways than being able to maybe talk to them on a technical level. And that was, I think, the biggest surprise that I had, was that there were all these skills that I'd learned in journalism that I didn't realize would benefit me in tech, but had a massive, massive impact, and really helped me and continue to help me to this day. And so, I think sometimes, a lot of times, people deride soft skills. Even the way that we frame it, hard skills versus soft skills, I think is really, really unfair, because it's necessary. Communication skills are things that are really important, and they make everyone's job easier and better. And if you are able to communicate well with people, you can get so much more done. And it can be such a huge advantage. And I didn't realize how important that would be and how useful that would be.
So true, especially given how underrated soft skills are, because a lot of folks often think that, as long as you're talented, as long as you know how to code, you can lock yourself in a room, shell out great code, and then be that, the team genius. In reality,
Right.
I have seen folks that are probably very talented engineers. They know what they're doing, but I would never want to work with them in terms of like how they communicate, how they ask for things, how they tell you what their opinions are. And you're like, wow, this person's very pushy about that kind of stuff. And like,
no, you're exactly right. I mean, that goes back to like my early experiences in my computer programming classes in high school, where like I was like, I don't want to work with you. I don't need to do this. Now, I'm lucky that I was wrong, and I was wrong. I would have done just fine studying computer science in college. I would have been just fine, and I would have found my people, and it would have been okay. But I had other interests, and so I didn't have to do that. And I still kept up with, learning to code and keeping up with things that were happening in the industry, outside of school. But you're right. It is about, and I also feel like, yes, you do have those people. You always have unicorns. You always have those one-offs of those people who are just really brilliant, and they can get away with anything. And that goes for people who are really good speakers and have really good communication skills too, because those people can be really difficult to work with as well, right? But you have these brilliant jerks, which I think is a phrase, and that exists in every field. And there are some people who are talented enough and are good enough, they can get away with it. That is absolutely true. Most people cannot. And most of us are not going to be those people. So it is really important to be able to know how to communicate and work together. And I think even if your day is doing coding in and out, being able to explain why you made a decision, or why your opinion is what it is, or why you are, wanting to work on this thing, goes such a long way. I mean, I talk to so many developers who they get frustrated, engineers who get frustrated that they're not getting their changes, pushed in. They're not able to work on things they want. And sometimes, I'll talk with them. I'm like, okay, well, how are you talking about this with your team? And you realize that the breakdown is coming, that they're, in their mind, they think they're being very clear and that all the advantages make sense, but they're not doing a good job expressing that. And they're not doing a good job listening to feedback and taking into account, okay, if I make this change, it might have this effect on this other thing that will be bad, And so being able to communicate, I think, is really, really important.
Right. And even conference talks, right? It's one of those things where you go to a conference where somebody is talking about some enterprise features, like, this is going to secure your environment by these 3 environment variables. And you're like, this is the most
what does that mean?
Boring talk ever. I don't want to listen to that. Instead of, somebody that comes in, even if they're less technical, but they're excited about it.
But they're excited.
Night and day.
No, totally. Because the thing is, I think we do 2 things in our world. I think that we overestimate how difficult it is for people to be upskilled on a technical level. I think that we make it seem like that is way harder than it is. And I think we underestimate how hard it is for people to be upskilled on a social and on a communications level. And I think people, so I think you have this situation where people think that it's much harder for people to learn to code than it is for people to learn to talk. And that's not true. They're both different skills and they're both challenging, but people can learn to do both. And one isn't any better or harder, than the other. Which is why I don't even like that, designation hard and soft, because it denigrates one. But I feel like we overestimate. Oh, well, a lot of people do this to themselves. I see this with students all the time. I see this with people who are switching careers all the time, where they're thinking, oh, I can't learn to code, or I can't learn to take on this skill because it's too difficult. And maybe you don't want to be a coder day in and day out. I mean, I wouldn't want to. I like to play with code, but I would not enjoy my career being somebody who is literally just committing and writing code all day. That for me would not be super, super great. I enjoy working with product a lot more, but that's the thing. There are all these other skills. You can be a product manager. You can be a program manager. You can be a technical writer. You can work in marketing. There are all these other avenues and things. And like, I talk to people because, the media business is not doing great right now. And I left, I think within the few months after I left, I think there were, I don't even know how many tens of thousands of layoffs there were in journalism. And it was really scary because I saw a lot of my friends lose their jobs. And a lot of people have come to me over the last 4.5 years asking, okay, how do I get a job that's not in media? And these are people who don't necessarily want to work in comms or PR. And I have nothing but respect for people who work in comms and PR. I don't do that. I don't know if there would be a challenge for me to do that, to be honest with you. But I talk to people who are looking at these skills and they think, okay, well, I can't do anything else. You could go to a tech company because you were technical. And I'll talk to them. I'll go, okay, no, but if you're a managing editor at a publication, that is the same thing as being a PM. It is identical. You just have to slot out one thing for another. And you're going to have to learn some new skills and learn some new things, but you're going to be able to do it because you've learned new things all the time. That's the thing. I talk to people who are IT professionals, IT pros in kind of the old sense, and they look at all the DevOps stuff and the way that cloud has happened, and they feel really overwhelmed and they're going, I can't keep up with all this new stuff. And I'm going, okay, you're going to have to learn some new things, but many of your old skills will translate over into what you do in this new thing. And it's not going to be as hard as you think it is. And so that's something I talk to people, especially like students, like I said, career switchers, people who might be coming through non-traditional means. I think they sometimes they convince themselves this is going to be impossible for me to do. And it's not. And again, it doesn't mean that every single person needs to be that hardcore engineer. There are so many other things you can do and so many other ways you can help. And it takes all parts.
There's a lot of that artificial gatekeeping that happens where
Yes.
Just the other day, so I work in developer tools for the web, and I had this conversation with somebody that was like, yeah, I wish we would stop dumbing down the experience of this person from outside the company was mentioning this. I wish we would just stop dumbing down the experiences because web developers need to know the ins and outs of really?
Why?
Like, no, they don't. They absolutely do not. Like, for me to get a website, I don't need to know how the JavaScript compiler works, and I don't care.
No, and if you go back again, like my entryway, and also, I feel like I hate that so much. I hate that artificial gatekeeping. That's such a great term, because think about how many of us who are a little bit older, how we learned to write web apps. We had a text editor, and we had HTML, and maybe some lines of JavaScript, and we were throwing things up, and we were, hitting refresh in our browser window, and we were seeing stuff come to life, and we were so excited that we were building things and we were making it work. That's what we did. Or you think about even going even further back, people who were building, apps and games for the Apple II and the IBM PC and for DOS and all that stuff, or even earlier than that with the 8-bit computer era. And like, that's how people get interested in things. You don't need to understand how, those compilers worked. You don't need to understand what was going on behind the scenes. You just wanted to make something to make it cool. So why do modern developers now need to understand all the ins and outs of JavaScript, which has become so complicated and is so many different things? And I love JavaScript, but it's like, you don't even know where to start, right? You're like, okay, well, which is why a lot of people just focus on React, or they focus on Node, or they focus on a framework, because that in and of itself is its own freaking world. But why do they need to understand how any of that is working in the back end? Like, why does that matter? If you want to, that's awesome. Please do and work on that. But like I thought the whole goal of this, I mean, at least for me, the whole appeal was that we can create things and we anybody can do it, and we're adding to it. Like that to me has always been the power of the web, is that anybody can add to it, anybody can do it.
I like that. So it's creativity that at the end of the day,
Totally.
if you want to encourage somebody to build a website, how is it helping them to be creative, to know the ins and outs? Well, here's how the browser processes your web request
Right.
and all the
No, who cares? Who cares? And now some people might, right? Some people might get really into performance data and they might really want to know, okay, well, how can I speed this up, or why is this happening this way? And that's awesome. And I say, go for it. And please, I love to watch those talks, even though I don't understand all of them. But I love to watch it mostly because I take that back. I love to watch them when people are excited and are really into what they're doing. Even if I don't understand everything they're talking about, I get a lot from that experience. But that should not be a prerequisite. Like, I think that's why I love the stuff that you work on, like, is so great, because it makes it easy for people to do stuff, and it helps enable that creativity, because those are the ideas that are going to wind up, changing things. It's like Jeff Bezos was not the world's greatest programmer when he started a website to sell books.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Like yes, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, very technical guys, very smart guys, but they were also building tools to try to make it easy for other people to build things, right? But Jeff Bezos was not, like, he just wanted to sell some books and he thought a website might be a good idea. Pierre Omidyar, like, he wanted to be able to buy Pez dispensers and have an auction for them, right? Like, these are that's how eBay was born. Like, these are people who, now he was very technical, but these are these ideas and these creative things that I think so much innovation comes out of creativity. It doesn't come out of just, what is the technical challenge here, and we understand every aspect about how it works. It's like, no, we want to solve a problem. We want to create something. Now we're going to figure out how to build it.
There's a good reason we're not writing binary right now and testing
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. We're not writing binary right now. And again, if you want to, go for it. But we're not. We have frameworks and higher level languages for a reason. So yeah, I feel like that artificial gatekeeping, I love that term, is really negative. And I feel like it makes people feel like, okay, well, if I can't do all of this, then I don't deserve to be here. Screw that. No.
I've heard about so many stories of people even dropping out of
Yes.
the computer science program because of this.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I will not know how to do the tree sorting algorithms. Like, yeah, that's fine. You don't need to. I've been in the industry for, I don't know, 7-8 years. I have never had granted I'm a PM, but I deal with code. Not once have I had to deal with how about figure out the fastest way to sort this tree?
No, and the great thing is, and again, we're all building on the shoulders of giants, but because of great work that other people have done, we have Stack Overflow, we have Google, we have resources that we can look up and we can reference. It's like it takes all types. Yes, there are going to be some of those people who need to do that low level, really hard work that are so smart, and I'm so grateful for them. But that's not everybody. That's just kind of not everybody's going to be that engineer who can get away with bloody murder. That's not going to be the case for everybody. But it takes all types. We need PMs. We need people who have product vision. We need people who are design experts. We need people who think about usability and accessibility. We need people who think about how to communicate with people. We need marketing people. We need all types. And I think just trying to make people feel like, oh no, if I don't get all of this, then I shouldn't even try. I see that a lot too, where people will just drop out because they're like, oh, well, I can't be good enough to do this one thing, so I shouldn't even bother. It's like, okay, this isn't playing professional football, right? This isn't one of those things where there are only going to be, 300 people in the world that can do this, because it's not. It's like we don't have enough. We don't have enough people to do all the work that we want to get done, right? This is not the Olympics. I know that so many of us in tech like to think that we're the most important and most rarefied people. We are not, and it takes all types. And again, there are these skills that people have that I think so oftentimes we think that, okay, because I know how to do something, everyone does. And so we sell ourselves short.
Tech industry is big, very, very big, and there's room for everyone.
In fact, it gets better the more people you have, because you have these different perspectives and you have these different eyes. Honestly, that's again, kind of one of the great things that's happened with open source and free software over the last 20 years or so is having more people looking at things and contributing to things has made things better, and has opened things up. But I think like the more diversity we have, the more different types of people you have, like you're going to have different perspectives and people who will see things in a different way, which is so important and so fun.
To me, as an engineer, if I would be writing software that I need to ship in front of customers, they'd probably hate the UI. I'm so grateful that I work with designers and
Right.
researchers that do this as their job, that they look and say, then nobody will understand this. And I'm like, you're right.
Right.
You're right. Cause I did not think about it that way.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many times like I was dealing with something today where we made some sort of video preview, and we didn't think about how the motion graphics might impact people who might have different types of epilepsy. Unfortunately, what we were doing, it wasn't going to trigger anything in anyone, but it brought up, it was like, okay, I'm not even thinking about, those things. And like, that's why it's important to have those other perspectives. Accessibility is another area, which is massively important, making sure that things work well with screen readers and people who have other, sight, challenges, or people who, I was hit by a car a couple of years ago. I was crossing the street, and a car just wasn't paying attention, just whammed in and hit me. And I broke my right wrist, and I'm right-handed. And I was in a cast for a couple of weeks when I couldn't even move. I didn't have any mobility at all. And so that made writing and coding really, really difficult. And it opened my eyes. I'm sad that it took that experience to really open my eyes to accessibility stuff, but it really did, because it made me think, okay, I was able to appreciate, the people who had done more, but B, I was really able to say, oh, these are challenges and these are ways I've never even thought about it when I design something or when I, do something. I've never even given this a thought, and about what it would be like if I had to do this with one hand. And what a great perspective that was for me, honestly. And so I try to remind myself of those things. But that's why we need more people involved. Like you need those designers and UI experts who are going to tell you, Den, I get what you're trying to do. No one's going to do this. And when we also need people who are like, okay, does this work well with people who are colorblind? Does this work well with people who have, other, abilities or whatever? Like that's really important.
Like a lot of the ethical challenges with AI, right? How many
Yes.
times have we seen this? If only you had somebody on the team that had the experiences that now you're seeing tweeted about, maybe you did not think about having this PR disaster in your hands now.
No, 100%. Like maybe if we'd let other people's experiences, there was, so Apple got into a lot of hot water when they were, had proposed some changes for the way that they would be dealing with iMessages that kids would send to one another on the iPhone. And it's supposed to be, they announced this a couple months ago, and they said, okay, well, if kids are sending each other pictures that our AI says is nudity, then we will alert the kid, and then we'll tell their parents. And a lot of privacy groups rightfully shot back and were like, that could potentially put kids who might be in homes who aren't accepting and might have like other situations in danger. And Apple announced this week that they will be making changes to that policy. And in fact, they will still be showing kids and kind of alerting them, hey, this has, nudity or whatever the content may be, that you can choose to, view this or not, but it's not going to alert their parents. And that felt like a huge win. And again, I think that it was one of those things where it was like, I know that the people who were working on that had good intentions and had good ideas, but they hadn't considered the perspective of, okay, what if this is a 13-year-old who doesn't live in a home where they can be open about who they are, or who, even if friends sent them something and they didn't pay attention to the pop-up and their parent is alerted that they looked at something, untoward, that they're now going to potentially be in danger and trouble. Those are real things you have to think about. And clearly they hadn't. So I'm really glad that they reversed course, at least on that aspect of how that stuff works.
Right. But again, it emphasizes the need to have those diverse perspectives and
Yes,
people that are
100%.
thinking about that, right?
Yeah, you
Because
need those people in the room before you make the announcement, right? Like, at least in, they were able, at least to Apple's credit, they took the feedback. But yes, that's the thing. You need more diverse people in the room. Same thing with AI, as you were saying. You need people who are in that room to look at things. You also need data sources that aren't coming from a place of bias. Because we've seen that happen too, where the models are trained on certain data and will make decisions that are not correct, and that can be really, really scary. And so you need to have people who are looking at it from an ethical standpoint and having more perspectives, because AI is so exciting and it's going to transform so many things. It already has, but it could go real wrong real quick if we're not careful about how we deal with it and if we aren't ethical about how we approach it.
And this conversation is going great, and I feel like we can be talking for hours more. But I have one last question for you, Christina. If you would tell our listeners from your experience, your career, one piece of unconventional advice, and this is the kind of stuff that you don't read on blogs too often, you don't see it in comments. What's that? What was the one piece of advice that you'd give them in their career in tech that helped you be where you are today?
I will say this, and I would give this advice to anybody, regardless of what part of tech you're in. Write every day if you can, even if it's just for yourself, even if you're not publishing for anyone else to see. Get your thoughts out there. It's really, really important. It's helped me a lot to synthesize and see how I see things, to get across how I feel about things. You get better the more you do it. I would say write every day, and I would also say keep a log of the interesting things and the exciting things that you come across, because that can be things that can both inspire new ideas, might give you, other opportunities to look at. It might, help improve your knowledge in a certain area. So I would say write and take notes on the cool things that you see. That would be my advice.
This is fantastic advice. And Christina, for folks that want to follow you online, learn more about what you're doing, where can they go?
Thank you so much. So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm film_girl on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram at film_girl. I'm trying to get to 10,000 Instagram followers. I'm way behind. But if I can get there, I've promised my podcast co-host that I will convince the people at Microsoft to let me wear the Clippy costume, and that I will like terrorize people in it. So that's a promise. So follow me on Instagram to get my numbers up there. And then I do a podcast about just a tech and nerd culture called Rocket. It's on Relay FM. So that's Relay FM relay.fm/rocket. And I do another podcast with my friend Brett Terpster, who's a software developer as well, called Overtired. And that's overtiredpod.com. So
excellent. Christina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Dan, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me. I really appreciate this.
This has been great.